Hi, and welcome back to Heimler's History Economics Edition. In the last couple of videos, we've looked at the aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve. And we've looked at the aggregate supply curve both in the short run and the long run. Now all that's left is to smush them all together in a lovely, juicy economic sandwich. And what's the meat of that sandwich? I'm the meat of that sandwich. Now, when we put the aggregate supply and aggregate demand curves on the same graph, it's known as the ADAS model. And we're going to spend a healthy amount of time in graph land today, so get your dang passport, it's graph time. So here's the ADAS model in all its terrible and wonderful glory. And as in previous videos, you can see here on the y-axis is the economy's aggregate price level, which is measured by the GDP deflator. And on the x-axis is the economy's real GDP. Here's the aggregate demand curve, here's the short-run aggregate supply curve, and the long-run aggregate supply curve. And here in the middle where they all meet is that magical happy town of equilibrium. And that equilibrium holds true for the short run. And it's here at short-run equilibrium that quantity of aggregate output supplied is equal to the quantity of aggregate demanded by consumers, firms, the government, and the rest of the world, which is to say, all the spenders in our economy which make up real GDP. So here at the short-run macroeconomic equilibrium, this is the short-run equilibrium aggregate price level, and down here is the short-run equilibrium aggregate output, which is GDP, and remember that we abbreviate that as Y. Now you'll remember with regular old supply and demand, the supply and demand curves can shift, creating the conditions for a new equilibrium. And the same logic is applied here, except on a macroeconomic scale. So when the aggregate demand curve shifts, either way, this is what's known as a demand shock. A negative demand shock means a decrease in aggregate demand and the curve shifts leftward here. And this creates the conditions for a new short-run equilibrium here. Got a new equilibrium price and a new equilibrium GDP. Now the technical term for this condition right here is called stagflation. And that means that wages are stagnant but the dollar is becoming more inflated. And this is what happened during the 1970s here in America. But a positive demand shock will shift the curve to the right, creating the conditions for a new equilibrium here. And this is what happened when GDP skyrocketed during our time in World War II. Okay, easy enough. Now when the short run aggregate supply curve shifts, it's called a supply shock. When the curve shifts to the left, that means that production costs have increased and producers decrease the aggregate supply. And on the other hand, a positive supply shock shifts the curve to the right. And when it shifts to the right, that is caused by decreased production costs. And again, anytime it shifts, we have an occasion for a new equilibrium point. Okay, all of that I hope seems relatively straightforward. So the graph as it stands tells us about the short run, but nothing about the long run. So let's look at the long run aggregate supply curve. Now, if you saw the last video about aggregate supply, you'll remember that the reason this curve is vertical in the long run is because in the long run, aggregate supply is not affected by changes in price. And I won't get into that here. You can go watch that one if you need an explanation. Okay, so what you need to remember is that the LRAS curve tells us what is the potential output of a given economy, which we represent here at YP. So when the aggregate demand curve and the short run aggregate supply curve and the long run aggregate supply curve intersect, that means that the economy exists in long run macroeconomic equilibrium. So let's see how all of these things work together when things start shifting. Now suppose for some reason aggregate demand decreases, and that will move us to a new equilibrium point right here. So at this point, the economy is not operating at its full potential. And we call this space right here a recessionary gap. Now this kind of recessionary gap occurred in the 1930s in Germany and led to Hitler's rise to power. So the reason why we don't like recessionary gaps is, you know, Nazis. Now, a recessionary gap is going to lead to high unemployment in the short run. But in the long run, wages will adjust and the short run aggregate supply curve will shift here and create the conditions for a new equilibrium. And that new equilibrium point matches our long-run aggregate supply curve and the nation's potential output. Now let's flip it. Let's say there's an increase in aggregate demand, and that will shift the curve to the right. And in that case, it will create a new equilibrium here. Now this gap is called an inflationary gap. But again, as nominal wages rise in the long run, the short-run aggregate supply curve will shift here, creating a new equilibrium point here. And when the short run does that, it comes right back into line with the long run aggregate supply, and the economy is producing at its potential output. So what this is trying to tell us is that in the long run, the economy will always correct itself. So when President Herbert Hoover woke up on October 29th, 1929 to find that all the stock market prices had collapsed, he took a very logical position. He said, if we just wait this out, everything's going to be fine. And in the long run, he was correct in this assumption. But the problem is, when people are living in cardboard boxes, they don't want to wait for economic models to sort themselves out. And so they called for government intervention in the form of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Okay, that's equilibrium in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. I'll see you next time. All right, thanks for watching. It means the world to me that you would offer your time to something that I made. If you think it's worth me making more, then subscribe to this channel and join along. And if you found this video helpful, then click the like button and maybe it'll find its way to other economics students. All right, bye.